Okay, we are recording. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Greg Dion. I'm with the Michigan Department of Education. I'm the supervisor of the Curriculum and Instruction Unit in the Office of Education Improvement and Innovation. And today we're here on this webinar to talk about pretty specifically the intent to apply for the Competency-Based Education Pilot, which is Section 21J of the State School Aid Act for this year. And I'm going to switch documents real quick just to get us all calibrated on the same page here to the memo that you saw that had this information in it. And so I'm going to put that up and just kind of quickly walk through it. But this is the memo that went out on September 21st. And the hope here was that we could get some information out as soon as possible to districts with this grant, particularly because there's a fair amount of work, and if you look at the components within the legislation in the planning grant that we're going to talk about, there's some front-end work that needs to be done. So I'll talk a little bit more about the legislation and the grant later, but as you can see, it's $500,000. It's essentially a planning grant for this year, and so we have some time to be able to put a program together, and I'll have more on the application and those kinds of things. But this is the webinar, obviously referenced in the letter, and a couple of contacts. Mary Head here at the Michigan Department of Education is our departmental analyst, and she can answer questions about the application and some of the logistical things. And then my contact information is here. It was on the memo at the bottom, and I can share that again as well. But please feel free to reach out if you have any other questions about the grant or competency-based education in general. Now I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint document. And just before we get started, like I said, for those of you who just joined, we are recording, and I'm happy to address questions. I'm going to certainly dedicate some time at the end of that, so please put them in the chat. Just with this many participants, it's tough to manage microphones. If there's something that you need follow-up on, you can certainly contact me. Or if it's something that you absolutely might need to share, you can raise your hand, and if time allows, we can go ahead and share some information that way. So in general, I'm just going to kind of set the stage a little bit and talk about competency-based education in general, and then I'll talk more about the grant in a moment here. But competency-based education fits well into our Michigan's top 10 and 10 goals and strategies. And then we look at these pieces of the systemic infrastructure here, these four components. You'll see the blue circle at the top titled Learner-Centered Supports. Within there, that's where we talk about things like deeper learning, personalized learning, differentiated supports such as multi-tiered systems of supports, an aligned curriculum, and feedback. This is also where that assessment component really fits in. But I think that competency-based education kind of goes beyond that, and we start to look at things like the education workforce and teachers being trained in some of the components of competency-based education. What's the professional development look like? How are we partnering with some of the higher ed institutions so that teachers, as they're receiving their training in higher education, are also getting information on this. And then the partnerships, and I think that one of the benefits that we'll find of the pilot is that I think we'll have some good partnerships within communities that we can reference going forward. So it really fits in all of these components of the top 10 and 10 in the systemic infrastructure. In terms of competency-based education across the country, I know many of you have seen this slide, and some of you use it in your own presentations, but if we look back just 5 years, you can see that there's been a lot of work done in multiple states. So this is a policy scan, if you will. This is from INACOL, and what they did is in 2012 they did a policy scan of states across the country, and they looked at their level of basically their level of implementation, and it was mostly around policy and legislation. And if you look at, we'll go from top down, so the red states are the ones that are the more advanced, the green are developing, yellow are emerging, and then the white and the grayed in states are the ones that have less represented or nothing represented within their policy or legislation. And within the 5 years, you can see that Michigan began as an emerging state. I think that was back when seat time waivers were becoming very popular. And in 2017, with the latest scan, you can see that Michigan is still emerging state, although I think we're moving beyond that, so that's one of the things we'll contact them about. But if you notice the rest of the country, you'll see that a lot of those states that had nothing in there were now filled in and considered emerging states. And really that map of the United States has really kind of colored in. So I use this just to illustrate that, for one thing, the train has kind of left the station. We've got a lot of work to do, but other states are moving in this direction, and also that it's just not a trend in Michigan. We're seeing this around the country. The good news is that as more and more states participate and advance their own systems, then I think resources are going to grow and examples are going to grow. So what is competency? And there are a few definitions out there. And so this is what we have now is kind of a working definition. And these two components were taken from some of the work that Achieve did in their work with multiple states across the country. And first is that state of being or having the ability. So a student is competent in certain content. So this is where we get away from the social promotion or students kind of squeaking by with a D- in their courses. We're looking for a level of competency or proficiency that will allow them to move forward and be career and college ready. And then the second piece is kind of this thing that a person could have demonstrated a set of knowledge and skills. So for example, if you have sets of related standards that kind of graduate up into a bigger competency. A crude example that I use sometimes is rebuilding the engine in a car. If that's your competency, that's a pretty high level set of skills and knowledge that you're applying there. So things like, replacing the air filter and some of the hoses and those kinds of things are almost kind of like the standard. So they build up to that bigger competency. So the term is used in two ways, fairly universally across the country, I think. And those are kind of the two ways that we've really accepted them here in Michigan, and I think some of our districts that have started down this road have started to embrace as well. So what does it look like? So the other piece of the working definition here is these components of competency-based education, and this is from Chris Sturgis, and this is what we've seen in most of the literature now nationally. So Knowledge Works, INACOL, Competency Works, and some other organizations have really used these components as kind of that basis for competency-based education. And we found that as we work with districts in Michigan here, these components have continued to hold up very well. So you can see what they are on the screen. Some districts and or schools might be doing a couple of those, some might be doing all of them, and of course you could be doing some of them at different levels yourself within your schools and districts. But these are the components. So one of the next steps for us in Michigan here would be to develop our state definition, and I would be surprised if we have something terribly different than this, because this is what has shown up in most of the research that we've seen so far. And also in Michigan, we have accepted definitions of personalized learning, personalized teaching, and educational technology. So I've included those in the table here. And the personalized learning is the learning that the student does. And these are all the components that we would hope to see in that personalized learning system. So the student's choice, pacing being variable, the content is relevant, and it's based on proficiency, once again. And then there's the instructional delivery, which is the personalized teaching. Well, this is where that relationship between the student and the teacher lives. There's collaboration, there's a lot of student ownership, that the teacher becomes not just an expert in the pedagogy and the content, but also that learning partner, if you will, and that facilitator with the student. And then there's the technology component, which we've kind of left separately because the technology we consider to be the tools. And so the theory here is that you can have personalized learning and you can do personalized teaching without technology. However, I think that when you leverage the technology, you can do them better. And so I put these all in a table together to just kind of illustrate the connections that we have here between what has already been accepted in Michigan in terms of our 3 definitions here, and then what shows up in the literature around competency-based education. And then this table just is something that I use depending on the audience, but just to kind of show the difference between the traditional system, like for example, basically the educational system that I went through, and a competency-based system. You'll notice, you'll see things like a change in how seat time is used. So the credit's not based on seat time, but on proficiency. The pacing is variable, and it's based on student mastery and deeper learning. This gets us away from being able to just have a lesson plan designated for each day, and then whether or not the students know it, you move on, or if students are ahead, you still do that lesson. So you start to vary that pacing, and that's when you start to get into some of the small group work and some of the individualized work with students. Typically reporting is based on marking periods or courses, and not that you don't still do this within a competency-based system, but you're looking at targets and competencies, and those things can be reported when students have mastered them. So it's this idea of, as students advance, then you report that they've demonstrated that competency, and the reporting lives in real time, so students and parents can see that. And then the assessments, we've typically measured what students know, and now we're getting more sophisticated in measuring what students know and what they can do. And this kind of is a segue a little bit into the last one here, which is where content was delivered mostly or exclusively in the classroom, and now we're finding that we need to be more creative in how we award credit for some of those things done outside of the classroom. So some of those camps, for example, or some of the experiences that students have with clubs, or some of the activities at the school that take place outside of the walls of the school. How do we then bring that back and honor the learning that the students have done, and count that towards them being competent in the content? And back to the student ownership, the other thing we're going to get to eventually, and this is just a mock-up, is changing the ownership of the transcript from the school to the student, but also having that transcript and that report be a good demonstration of what the students know and what they can do. So you not only have all of your academic content, you can add things like 21st century skills in here, digital badges, awards, their interests in here. So now when a student takes this transcript to an employer or to a higher ed institution, they've got more data to show them one of the things that we heard as we were out working with higher ed partners and workforce partners for that matter was that some of the traditional transcripts didn't give them a good enough representation of what the students knew, what the students do, or what kind of other expertise of areas of interest that the students had. So this is going to move us closer to that reporting system that allows us to report in more detail and give the student more information, give the higher ed institutions more information, and also give the workforce more information. And so one of the questions that always comes up is, what about colleges? And we know that there's some work to be done here in Michigan. This convening was done through Achieve, and they got colleges from around the country together with some K-12 educators to have this conversation about competency-based education and the transcripting. And the higher education experts that were there basically said that they receive transcripts from multiple sources. They get some from other countries, for example, some from home schools, some from traditional schools, and so they're essentially used to seeing different kinds of transcripts. I would also add to that, though, that at least in Michigan for sure, there will be work that needs to be done around helping them understand what some of these reports look like. So it'll be kind of a new partnership in terms of sharing the transcripts and the student information with those higher ed institutions, but being able to give them more information about the student and the student being able to take more information to them. And then we know there are students that are going to go directly into the workforce. And in 2014, we held a summit and we brought together K-12 leaders, we brought together higher education leaders, and also folks from the workforce, and had a conversation about what it meant to be career and college ready. And one of the main points of the conversation was, again, about the transcripting, and it was our workforce partners that really kind of prompted us to consider how we might report things in a more detailed way. So when we started talking about this competency-based reporting system, and we had conversations about it, that was something that they agreed would be helpful. So as an employer, a potential employer, they could go into that report and get a better idea of what skills and knowledge the students have. And then this example on the right here is these are just it's a group of digital badges. And so this is from a cybersecurity company, and that's one of the things that we're hearing a lot about. So I just include this as an example because things like digital badges are ways to represent competency within the reporting systems. And some of the workforce partners are already heading down that road. Not that we have to go to all digital badges, but it is a form of students being able to represent that they're competent in content. And then here are just some partners that around the state have been active in supporting this work so far. Okay, and so now I want to talk a little bit more specifically about the grant, and this is Section 21J of the State School Aid Act. It's a competitive grant, and it's for 3 years. They've allocated funds for 1 year, but within the legislation, it's indicated as a 3-year grant, and it's really more of a planning grant. And so at this point, we are, of course, working on the criteria and the application and all that, but our thought now is that we'd be looking at approximately 10 districts for this first round, and would likely end up with some districts that are further down the road with implementation, maybe some that are in the middle, and then some that are just starting out. So potentially we end up with a kind of learning network through this. So that's the thought now. We're asking that through the application process that districts do go ahead and submit the 3-year plan. The budgets will be for 3 years. So we are going to move ahead as if there will be funding for the 3 years, because that's what's indicated within the legislation. And essentially, if you look at the main, like before you get into the components of the legislation, they're talking about the design and implementation of programs, and that being to provide enhanced choice to pupils and parents for completion of high school. So that's pretty general. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that in a second, but we have until March 31st to announce the grant recipients. The reason we're releasing this now, and we did the intent to apply, is because first we wanted to gauge interest among districts, but we also wanted to give districts time so that they could go back and work with their boards and their communities to have conversations about this if they intend to apply, because this is something that we think takes some time to kind of work with the communities on. And then there is a legislative report that's due December 1st of 2018, and that's in the legislation. That is primarily around the planning that's been done and talking about what types of measures we'd be looking at, and scalability and some other considerations. So here is kind of an outline of what's in the legislation, and I'll walk through these just kind of briefly, and then I have some additional considerations that I want to share as well. But first, looking at the multiple and innovative methods to determine a pupil's achievement of competencies. This is where the legislation talks about things like public presentations, submission of research papers, attaining marketable workforce credentials, mentoring other students, those kinds of things. And it also cites that a competency assessment used to determine mastery is aligned with the academic content standards. The other component here is the notion of student-driven projects. And it says in the legislation that the curriculum allows for a majority of instructional time to be spent doing those. They talk about things like capstone projects as part of the graduation requirements. And then this is where the legislation also talks about things like 21st century skills. And they name those as leadership, teamwork, problem solving, and communication. And it also states that the instructional time may be on a non-traditional calendar. So throughout this, as we look at waivers that might need to be considered, some of those things will kind of be exposed to this as well. A comprehensive formative assessment system. So we'll be looking at the process that you plan to use. And again, I think as we start to gather some of these resources, we'd like to have some things that we can share out among the districts so that we kind of put together this system of support for all of the districts. Partnerships with employers and higher ed institutions, or both. And to do that, that is something that we would ask for in the application, but in the legislation they talk about that in terms of providing contextualized learning and the development of work-ready skills. The next one is a transition away from a grade level system. And this is one that I think is going to take some work on our part and a lot of close collaboration with the districts. This is one that is a big change, so as you're considering applying for the grant and working with your boards and your communities, I think this is one that's going to take a fair amount of conversation. So looking at a competency-based system of student promotion. So again, getting away from that social promotion. But the legislation does cite specifically that the plan should include messaging to parents, talking about the benefits and the steps taken to implement a competency-based education model. participation in the statewide assessment, so a commitment to do that, and then other information determined by the department. And so these additional considerations are the things that we're looking at now, and we're developing the application, and so it will include the components of the legislation, and then these are the other things that we're looking at for additional considerations. So one being educator evaluation. How does that fit, or how do you plan to continue your model of educator evaluation as you implement competency-based education? The second one, what is your capacity for implementation right now? So it doesn't mean that you have to be implementing or you have to be ready, but we definitely want to know what your capacity is. The data collection and student reporting, and this is to kind of, in one way, to give us a baseline to see where you're at, and there are some supports there. But the thing about competency-based education that's unique is also that the reporting is different. So you're reporting on those competencies, as I stated earlier, but also being able to use that data to develop your systems of supports for students. We'll be looking for an implementation timeline and a management plan, and then also a budget. And again, those are things that we're looking for over a 3-year period. We definitely want to make sure there's a commitment from district leadership. And then what's your rationale for moving to a competency-based education system? Like I said, the allocation is $500,000. So, the rationale is probably not going to be, for the money to provide staff or anything like that. But typically, with the stakeholders that I've worked with, they ended up looking at a competency-based education model because it was a solution to issues that they were having in schools or within the district, or they knew that they could improve or move to another level of student success with that. And then, of course, the local board and community support. And again, this is why we wanted to get this out sooner rather than later, so that districts have time to do that work back home. So here's the proposed timeline now, and this is what I have mapped out through that legislative report. We'll have the new budget in June probably, so we'll know what the funding would be for next year. But if we walk through that, you can see that starting over to the left with October and November, we're going to get approval from the state board on the grant criteria. That's going to happen next week from today actually. So October 10th, the grant criteria is going to the board, and then once that's approved, we're going to release the application. Now we won't have the application in MEGS, and you'll see that that's coming up later, but we want to get the application information out to districts as soon as possible to give them maximum time to work on it. So we're planning to release that well before it's available in MEGS. So in November and through December, we'll have the application window open. We'll be providing some technical assistance. There may be partners that are going to engage that would come here and work with districts for free as well if they want assistance with their planning or completing their applications. And then we're looking for the application to be available in MEGS in December, and so that's when you can actually go in and submit the grants. And then in December through February, we'll be collecting the applications and reviewing the grants. If we move into March, that's when we award the grants. So we'll announce the awardees then, and we plan to have a kickoff meeting with the recipients to talk about how we want to go about implementation and the other things that we can benefit here to build some capacity down the road. And then April through December, we'd be looking at implementation and further planning, and then submitting the legislative report on December 1st. So this is not the overall competency-based education timeline, if you will, and but this is specific to the grant and the application. So we'll have more information on the overall competency-based education timeline for the 3 years in the future. So the other thing is, how do we build capacity? Because the pilots will be a good way to plant some seeds, and we're going to learn a lot from that, and I think we're going to build some capacity. But there's much more to be done, and I think the folks that have implemented will agree that it takes more than that. It's quite a commitment. So we, through this process and through other avenues, we'd like to find out ways that we can support more local districts, and what supports do they need, and how do they access those. So overall, we're looking at how do we support the districts. We'll be convening a steering committee, and that steering committee will be working on first a definition. We'll be looking at a framework, but also helping to inform some of the policy, and then maybe looking at some additional resources, and then how do we think about things like professional development or assistance with some of the reporting tools and those kinds of things. A superintendent's network, since we know that the superintendents will be the key implementers as well as the decision makers in a lot of this. We agree that it's important that the superintendents convene to further their knowledge, but also to be able to support the district in the implementation. And then, of course, the pilot grant, which is what this webinar is about today. So those components together, and this is not all that's entailed in building capacity, but for year one and for kind of the phase one, we think these are the components that we're going to be able to start with and start to build that capacity. So now I'm going to look over to the chat for some questions. So please type your questions in if you have them. So first question from Jeff, wondering how well this grant would fit into a middle school standards-based grading. And I think that, and not knowing exactly what that looks like in a specific school, but I think that the standards-based grading is almost that precursor to competency-based education. So if you're looking at, or you're actually implementing standards-based grading, and you want to go to competency-based education, then I think that next step would then be to build those competencies. So you have the standards, you're assessing against those, now building up into those competencies and building your assessments around those. One of the other things we hope to do is to be able to get the standards in a readable format, so that we can build competencies electronically. And so I think that when that's available and you have that standards-based grading in place, you can then move to that next level, which is the competency-based. 500,000 for 1 year, and then we're uncertain what the funding would be determined for years 2 and 3. Yeah, the answer is that the legislature did not commit funds for the years 2 and 3. That's why we're asking for 3-year plans, because we want to be able to take that information and share it back with the legislature and say, you know, we have districts that are interested in doing this. They've already went through planning. We have a system in place to support them. We have the capacity to build something here to support this, and then, you know, I think that will help the decision. However, I would tell you that the legislature and the governor's office as well are very interested in this. So we can't be certain whether or not it will be funded, but I mean, the budgets are basically 1 year at a time anyway. So we think if we have the 3-year plans and the commitment from the districts, that will be helpful. Funding divided up among, is the funding divided up among the chosen districts? And the answer is yes. And so within the applications, we'll be, looking at within the budgets, especially what the funding request is and what you plan to do with it. But it will be divided up among the districts that are awarded the grant. And then assuming the grant is calling for a district, pre-K through 12 / middle college commitment versus a school level application. And the answer is yes. The legislation specifically uses the term districts, so it's not intended for individual schools. We're looking at $500,000 per district to implement plan. The answer is no. It's $500,000 total. If we end up, that's why I use the word approximately. I would say we'll probably end up in that neighborhood, but we also want to see what's in the plan. So I think if you're planning, I mean, I think that would be like somewhere in that range, although the decision right now is not to cap it or to make it a certain amount, because we want to see what examples might help build capacity in other ways. But I think as a ballpark, that would be safe. To be eligible, does every building in your district have to implement competency-based learning? Not necessarily, not right off the bat. What we're looking at right now is allowing districts to submit a plan that could include a phase-in. So it could be that you're going to start with grades K through 5 for a year and a half, and then ramp up to other grades in years 2 and 3, or it could be starting with subject areas across grade levels. So I think initially our thought is that you don't have to commit to the whole district going to competency-based right away, but we would want a plan that demonstrates how you plan to move in that direction and eventually get there. Let's see here. Can the grant be at an ISD level operating a consortium? I think that the legislation specifies that money would go to districts. I don't think we could exclude somebody from applying for that, and so I think I'd like to maybe have a little follow-up, and just to kind of see what the thought is, or what you had in mind there. The slides are not available yet, but they will be. Should the budget for 3 years then at $500,000 each year, or just 1 year? Well, we don't know. I would say if it's continued, it's a tough question, and hopefully we'll know more like once the budget process kind of gets going. But my hope and what I've been advocating for is there's more than $500,000 in the additional years, because we want to be able to build the infrastructure as well. So we have the pilots, but we know there are other things that could be done that we could share across pilot sites and across districts in general. So the budget that that you produce as part of the application, I would say if you feel like in years 2 and 3 you'll need additional funding and you have that budgeted and could justify it in your budget, it's something that we could definitely consider. Are ISDs eligible? Oops, sorry. Sorry, I'm scrolling down here. Are ISDs eligible? I think that I might have to do a little homework on that one here with some of our legislative team to see if that's what was within the intent. But I promise to get some of that information out in our next correspondence. PSAs are eligible. Does year 3 expect a district to be fully implemented? And I would say the closer we can get to that, the better. My sense is that folks in the legislature that are interested in this would like to see a pretty rapid implementation and deployment. However, I think if it's not feasible, and I know that that's possible because sometimes this is a 4 or 5 year journey to kind of get to that point, then I think that's something that we need to reflect in the plans. And if the district has a calculated strategic effort to get there, but it's longer than 3 years, I think that's okay. It's not that would preclude an application at all. The consortium being an alternative program operated on behalf of the county. Yeah, that one we'd have to look at. Maybe Michelle, maybe you and I can do a little follow up afterwards as well. And then the answer about the slides being available is yes. I will actually hope to post this recording as well. But at a minimum, the slides will be available. And I still see some typing going on here. Okay. Mike, thanks to the MDE team for supporting this work. Oop. Important work. Many thanks for all the great questions, regardless of how the grant money shake out. We're excited about the positive work that lies ahead. And thanks for saying that, Mike. I think that for me, the fact that this made it into the budget and that we have something to work with is very positive. I think that, in my opinion, that leadership here at the department is very interested in this. So the pilot is by no means the only way we plan to support this work. And so with the steering committee, the recipients of the grant, and also just in general folks that are interested in implementing competency-based education, we still plan to go ahead and develop this system at the state level because we know there are other resources out there. And quite frankly, I mean, we have a lot of other states that we can partner with to leverage some of those resources as well. So next question, with the size of the grant, and as you stated, hiring additional help will be difficult. Will this be factored in awarding the grants to smaller districts who need more hands to make this type of initiative happen? Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something that we will consider. We know that some of the smaller districts don't have, I wouldn't say they don't have the capacity, but like you said, the staff maybe to be able to just implement this. And so hopefully that's one of the things that comes out of this application process, is that we have additional information on what some of those specific challenges are. So for this, the planning grant, for example, we're looking at probably less full implementation, but this is also going to be very helpful information that we get from you with those unique circumstances that we can take back to the legislature and say, that these are the additional considerations. This is what it might take in terms of resources within some of these districts that have specific needs. So I think that information is going to be very helpful from an information perspective for us, but for the legislature as well. Thanks for raising that. More support or larger grants? Yeah, I guess the answer is, Matt, to your second part there about more supports or larger grants. I hope the answer is yes. I don't get to make all those decisions on the budget, but like I said, I think that's something that we can have as really good information to take back to the legislature and kind of let them know what some of those specific needs are. And and if there are other things that we can do as a department or some of the networks can do that supports the work that would happen in your district, so that you're not necessarily reinventing the wheel or doing all of that work on your own, then I think those are reasonable conversations to have as well. So if a PSA is expanding from K-8 to high school and wants to be competency-based, would that be eligible? I believe it would, yeah. Seems like a real opportunity to reimagine Michigan. I think so, and I think that it kind of puts us on the map with some of the other states that have had these pilots for a couple of years. I mean, we get to learn from some of them as well. But again, I think it's that starting point for like a real implementation of competency-based education. Are some specific Michigan districts that have a good CBE program already, and who? The answer is yes. And Mary, if you could follow up with me afterwards, I can get you some information, some contact information, because the districts that are implementing are always very willing to share. I think Mike Birdie is on this webinar in Kennewaw Hills, and they certainly have been at this for a while and have some really strong components of their system in place. At the board meeting on October 10th, we are also doing a presentation on competency-based education, and we're going to be featuring 3 of those districts or programs. So one will be Kennewaw Hills, the other will be Fraser, and then the Oakland Opportunity Academy from Oakland Schools. That is that's not a full district implementation, but it's an alternative ed program that's housed in a CTE center that is competency-based. Let's see, any SIS LMS systems folks are using that support CBE. And feel free to type those in the chat. I know there are some out there. This is one of the things that we hope at the state we can contribute to, helping with those systems and how we can build things into the data hubs or help with the model competencies to make that easier for you. And that could be something that we find resources for outside of the grant, obviously. Okay, so yeah, there's a couple of them. In the chat. Yeah, and several more options than a few years ago. Yeah, we are seeing that. And I like to think that the vendors are now responding to that. And so I think now that more states are going down this road, that we'll see even more of that, and it'll get more intuitive for the users. I'm just going to leave this on for a second because I know folks are still typing. I don't see any additional questions. And if I did not answer your question fully, please reach out and contact me. Here's my contact information. Also, Mary Head's contact information. So if you have questions about the pilot or the application or any of that, feel free to contact her. Meg's, this is not up and running yet, but when that's up and running, Eric Lipinski will be the contact for that. And then if you have any questions or you want to bounce ideas off myself, please do. If you're looking at implementation through the pilot or without the pilot, and you need help thinking through something or looking at some of the policy considerations and you have questions about those, feel free to call. We can have a conversation. We do that quite often with schools, and just kind of bounce ideas around. We can bring people accounting, teacher certification folks into the conversation to try to find some flexibility that might be there or answer specific questions that you might have. Okay, looks like we're done with questions. A lot of thank yous. I want to thank everybody for participating. And, oh, wait, one more. As a precursor to CBE, what districts are solid with SBG? I'm guessing that's standards-based grading. So if you want to type that in the box for Suzanne, that would be good. But I want to thank everybody. And again, my invite is sincere to please contact myself if you have any questions. And please do look to some of the examples, and the State Board of Education presentation will be a week from today on Tuesday, October 10th, and I believe we are presenting in the morning around 10 o'clock. So again, thanks everybody. It's good to see the interest here, and I look forward to working with all of you throughout the process here.